Hi, I'm David Peters, author of Death Letter, God, Sex, and War. Seminary Dropout is supported by listeners like you and me. You should support the show like I did. It's easy. Just visit supportseminarydropout.com.
You're listening to Seminary Dropout, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. Somewhere in between seminary and youth camp, it's Seminary Dropout. Let's go. Arleen Spenceley, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
You have written this just wonderful book on chastity. It's partly your personal story that you tell. You include other people's stories that are real life stories that illustrate the things you're talking about so perfectly. And then there's also theology and the reasons behind the things that you do or we should do as Christians. You talk a lot about the process of not only being a chaste person in the world today, but also because of your background in journalism, writing about it and that being very, very public.
Yes.
And as a consequence, you get a lot of feedback that most of us, if we follow that path, would not get. And so, you really, there's one story you told that really boiled it down, I thought. And you told a story about how somebody had asked you, do you ever worry that one day you'll wake up and discover that you're 45, still single, and past your sexual prime? And you said that you didn't worry about that. And you said, in order to worry about that, I would need to believe that the purpose of sex is pleasure and that we all better get some while the getting's good, which is pretty much, that's exactly the mentality of the culture. So
absolutely.
If that's not the purpose of sex, what is?
Well, I believe that sex is really like a sacred physical sign of the vows a married couple took on the altar where they were married. And I think, as far as the purpose sex serves, it's twofold. It's in part unity and in part procreation. And one of the best parts about it, obviously from what I've heard, as I've never had sex before, is it's pleasurable. It's supposed to be pleasurable, and married couples kind of have this cool opportunity to create a unique, pleasurable sexual relationship with each other after the wedding.
One of the things that you do so well is that you articulate what chastity is, because there's a lot of misnomers around that word. And honestly, Arleen, there was I had misconceptions about it. Like, you straightened out a lot of things that I didn't know about the word. And I think I kind of thought of chastity and virginity as interchangeable, but that's not really the case.
Correct. Yeah. It's amazing to me, especially when I've put this stuff in the newspaper. I get a lot of feedback, and in a lot of the emails and phone calls I get, people do use the words virginity, chastity, purity, abstinence interchangeably, and none of those words mean the same thing. And so it's been really important to me in the book and outside the book to kind of clarify the differences, because I have a lot of people, for instance, come up to me and say, I think it's great that you're going to be chaste until marriage, when, the reality is, if I get married, I'm going to be chaste after marriage too, because chastity isn't the same as abstinence. And I think a lot of the, resistance in our culture to the virtue of chastity is rooted in the fact that it is assumed it's the same as abstinence, and it really isn't. It's much deeper than that.
You say that chastity is a virtue that aims to integrate sexuality with the rest of the stuff that makes us human. The thing I like most about that definition is that I think it is so much more biblical and in the model that God has laid out for us, rather than virginity, because there's a lot of problems with virginity and using that terminology and making that the goal. And we can talk about that in a bit. But the idea of chastity seems to be putting sex in its proper place where God wants it to be in our lives.
Yeah, exactly that. Absolutely. It's I like to say, Chastity doesn't put sex on a pedestal like the culture that surrounds us does, and says, no, this is the number one thing. You've got to know you're sexually compatible with a person before you marry him or her. We don't, as chaste people, we don't put sex on a pedestal like that, but we also don't deny that it exists, which from what I hear in a lot of, youth group experiences among people of our generation, growing up, it was like that. Like sex was either ignored or, described as something bad. It just, simply in order to build a wall between kids and sex, which is really the last thing that youth leaders need to be doing. We don't need to be building walls between kids and sex.
So there's kind of two facets here. I mean, there's the outside world, and I don't think that we as Christians should expect non-Christians to act like Christians. But,
I totally agree.
But at the same time, we do need to see these differences in the messages that culture communicates and the message that we as Christians should communicate. And one of those messages that the culture communicates is that if it's hard, then that negates good. In fact, that's something you say. We live in a culture that doesn't like to admit that hard does not negate good. Meaning the culture's attitude towards sex is if it's pleasurable and if it's hard to avoid, then it must negate good, like you said.
Yeah. I actually recently read this other book, a fabulous book written probably before I was born, called The Courage to be Chaste. And the guy who wrote it, who's a priest, who actually just died, Father Benedict Groeschel, he discussed this, and he talks about how in our culture there's this attitude that all appetites must be completely satiated. But when you really think about it, for instance, like our appetites for food, well, it's not healthy to eat every time you feel hungry. It's not healthy to eat every time you feel like you might want some food. And it kind of works the same way, because there is, an appetite for sex. It's part of, humanity. And it can't necessarily always be healthy to constantly give in to every urge, And so, and I think that's what I mean when I say that, hard does not necessarily negate good, because these are some of the ways that we grow. These are some of the ways that we get stronger as people, by rising above those urges. It's a very animalistic thing to live life like we've got to do everything we feel like doing, but it's actually a very human thing, and a human to rise above those urges, because God gave us the ability to do that, and we need to, as a culture, hopefully learn to tap into that ability.
One of the kind of themes that you've had to deal with in discussing this publicly is that the available people for you to date is smaller than someone who doesn't care about this. And you even on your blog once, you got a comment and somebody said your options in the available pool of accomplished men is severely limited. 99.9% of all the men will have nothing to do with you, and you know it.
Oh, that was a good one. Yeah, I remember that comment.
And then you say that your decision to save sex deters a lot of men from dating you. And it's so funny, Arleen, because I was talking with a friend of mine who she's single and biracial, and she was telling me that she's on a dating website, and on the dating website, when you fill out your profile and you select your race, there's not a biracial choice. And so she had to either pick black or white, and so she chose black, and she can see that there are tons of people who are not interacting with her specifically for that reason, because they have said, no, I will not date anyone who is black. And she was telling me that she was telling some of her other friends that, and her friends were saying, Carrie, like you're half black and half white. You could just easily say white, and then that would really open up the pool of all these people. And when she's telling me that, I'm like, look, Carrie, think of all the racist guys you could be dating right now if you just didn't put black on your profile. And it's kind of I think it's the exact same way with what you're talking about. These people are assuming that you would want to date these guys anyway that don't share this value.
Exactly. The number one read post on my site actually has a little something to do with this. It's called Why I Don't Date Men Who Are Quote Unquote Willing to Save Sex for Marriage, because that's really what it comes down to. As somebody who's practicing the virtue of chastity, it's really easy to meet men who would be willing to save sex because that's what I want to do, but it's not part of their world. If only I gave them permission, then we would have sex. That's how they approach dating, and I don't think that relationships are as healthy or holy when two people in them have just completely different definitions of sex and completely different wishes for the relationship. And I have felt very much like your friend in that sense, because it does, once you I guess out yourself as a virgin, as I have many times in print, everybody knows, and that really does limit the pool of people from which I can pick. And it's funny because I remember one time one of my grandmothers was she liked the essays that I wrote for the paper about sex and chastity, but she was also really nervous because she thought, all these men are going to, be lining up to try to coerce you, into having sex now. And I was like, Nana, literally no one has ever tried to do that. They're not interested because they're not really looking for a woman. They're looking for sex, like those men. So they know they're not going to get it from me. And that's certainly not something that I see. So it is challenging. It's a fun challenge, mostly.
You told a great story, and it was so transparent about one of the times you wrote a piece on chastity and specifically your chastity for, I think it was when you were working for the Tampa Bay Times.
Yes.
And
I still work there.
And, okay. Right. Yeah, that's right. Because you left and you came back for a while, or have come back.
Yeah.
But one of the times when you published a piece and they put it on the front page of the website, and the stock photo that they use for you is not the most flattering.
Oh my goodness. That was a horrible morning. Oh my gosh. What had happened was, our essays and stuff tend to appear online before they appear in print at our paper. And so, the morning it appeared online, I was looking for it, and I knew it had appeared online. I think I got the clue because I was starting to get emails. And so I looked for it online, and when I got to the front page of our website, there was a giant picture of me under the words, "Why I'm a Virgin," in huge letters. And it was literally the worst picture of me that has ever been taken. And it was never supposed to go in our system. That was a mistake. The photographer who took it on a whim during a photo shoot for another story. And I told him, please don't put that in the system. I don't think he got my email because obviously it had ended up there. And some people who I've told this story to are like, oh, come on, you're just, you're your own worst critic. No, I showed my mother this picture and she was like, ooh, that is bad. So if your own mother says that, it's a horrible picture. And it was a Saturday, so I couldn't get a hold of anybody for like at least an hour. And the picture caused such a ruckus on the internet. I was getting comments on the essay multiple per minute, like multiple comments per minute. And these comments were cruel, like all related to my appearance. People weren't reading, what I wrote. They were just reading the headline and saying, well, obviously you're a virgin because you look like that. And thankfully I was able to get a hold of a web editor who immediately took the picture down. And he actually had to close the comments because he couldn't keep up with the frequency of them in order to moderate, because they always delete anything that's a personal attack, and basically everything was a personal attack at that point. So that was bad.
Well, and most people know that comments on the internet are generally pretty vicious and amoral and that kind of thing.
It's
and I can't imagine how much more so after you've just become so transparent. I mean, you really just open yourself up to the world. And then there's this picture, and we've all taken those pictures, that we would rather never see the light of day. And so you're just really open up to ridicule. And I think that really exemplifies a lot of what you have experienced, which is people who I think normally would probably claim to be very open-minded and tolerant, when you share this, become really judgmental and and intolerant, for lack of a better word. I mean, they do not, and it's so strange because certainly in the book and everything of yours that I've read, it's extremely non-judgmental. I mean, you're essentially telling your story and saying, this is why I choose this. And people, again, who claim to be very tolerant and open-minded are not accepting that, or are in effect saying that your story is invalid.
Oh yeah. I've gotten a lot of that. I think it's sort of like with a topic like this, like chastity, virginity, sex, you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to strike a nerve or you're going to strike a chord. And it's basically been, on those two opposite ends. It's been great responses, people who are supportive, who are encouragement, who are encouraging me, who have felt encouraged by what I wrote, or people who cannot bear to read what I write and not send me a nasty email because it's it's like a trigger, something that happened in their past or something that that they've come to believe or come to convince themselves to be truth has now been challenged, and I think that side of it always sort of feels like what I've written is a criticism of their life, when in fact my goal has always been, like you said, just to present my story, present this virtue to the public. And that's really how this all started. When I wrote my first sex essay for the paper, that was my goal, was just to introduce the virtue of chastity to the general public, because I had learned that there was that just widespread confusion about what the heck this virtue is. And I needed people to know that it wasn't abstinence. I needed people to know that it was so much greater than that, because I believed that they needed to know. And I certainly would never, force someone into, practicing it. I couldn't do that if I wanted to, but I don't want to do that. I just know there are a lot of people whose, ways of life aren't exactly resulting in what they hoped it would. And so this is an alternative that maybe they've never heard of. And if they'd like to try it, then at least now they have that opportunity.
And so, like I mentioned, you talk a lot about your story, but you also talk about the theology behind this. And so let's talk about that for a second. Are we are we as the church just making this up because we're so prudish? Or what precedent do we have that we follow that makes us think that this is a good idea?
Well, I think if we study love as Jesus introduced it to us, chastity is the most compatible way of life that aligns with it. You know what I mean? Like, obviously there are different forms of love and different ways to express love, but if we're going to be like Jesus or try, there's got to be a selfless element, to our love, and that's, in and outside of marriages. And I think, one of the most loving decisions we can make is to practice chastity. I think chastity prepares us for that, because it requires us to treat others with respect, and it also requires us to expect the best out of other people. Like I've heard a lot from people about how, no man is going to wait that long to have sex. No guy is going to date you for a while. If you're not going to have sex with him, you'll get dumped. And I've thought, I have so much more faith in men than that. Like I feel like men are born able and capable to save sex for marriage and to practice the virtue of chastity. And so part of loving men for me is holding that bar high, because I know they can reach it. If I don't hold the bar that high, I'm not loving them, because I'm not allowing them to live up to their potential, if that makes sense.
And of course they can, to affirm that. Arleen, I can remember I didn't have sex until my wife and I were married. And I remember the first job I had outside of college, and it was kind of I'd been fairly sheltered. I mean, I went to a Christian school and everything. And so it came up because my coworkers just talked about sex like nonstop. And so, I just bluntly but kind of nonchalantly mentioned that I hadn't had sex yet. And it was like they were seeing a unicorn, like an alien. And, I was kind of like you, like I didn't have anybody to impress. Like, I don't care. And, it wasn't like I didn't want to impress girls that didn't care about that anyway, so I didn't mind. But I think that the perception that that is almost non-existent is false. I think that there are tons of people out there who are following Christ's call to chastity in their life.
Absolutely. And that's really one of the greatest things that fueled my decision to write Chastity is for Lovers, is because virgins exist. Adults who are virgins exist, and we are ignored largely. People will say, nobody saves sex for marriage. Well, that turns the people who do into nobodies, and I've felt like I don't want the people who are out there living this lifestyle to feel like they're alone, because that is very easy to do. It's not true that they're the only ones, but in our culture, like you said, that's the idea that's out there. And so I've always hoped with everything that I've written that if nothing else, it reaches people just so that they feel like they're not alone, because I think that's one of the keys to practicing the virtue of chastity is community. It's, having access to people and surrounding ourselves on purpose with people who believe what we do. Because otherwise, all the voices that we hear are telling us that what we believe isn't true. And after a while, if that's the only voice we hear, we may begin to, lose our resolve to live in this way that God asks us to live.
One of my favorite things that you said in the book was, you said maybe chastity is old-fashioned, but to borrow a quote from a woman I met once at a church in Tampa, the old-fashioned way wasn't broken.
I love that quote. That was so
too.
good. Yeah.
I do too. And I think that, perhaps in the past there were some unhealthy ideas on the repressive side of sex. But I think my response to that is, how's the new way working out for us? I mean, we've got, even, culturally on a societal level, like we've just got this pile of broken relationships and in sexually transmitted diseases and abortions and all this stuff. And how is that working out for us? Now, as a Christ follower, those are not my reasons for being chaste. My reasons are to honor Christ, but it should be easy for us to see that there's something broken in the new way that we treat sex and act towards it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I often will share, especially when I'm speaking at a church or other event, that, part of chastity requires a commitment to critical thought. And there was a reader once, one of the few comments on that sex essay that didn't get deleted was from a reader who was kind of calling out the other commenters who had, described my lifestyle as a joke or what have you. Somebody said, they referred to a statistic that I included in the essay, which was that 98% of women and 97% of men ages 25 to 44 have had sex. And that's according to the National Center for Health Statistics. And, after all these other commenters had said, this lifestyle will never work. I don't think Arleen's right, blah, blah, blah. This other commenter said, I understand your issues with Arleen's lifestyle, but look around, like how happy or how well are the 98% really doing? What do relationships look like right now? Is that really working out? And I thought that was an interesting little bit of critical thought from one of my readers, and I was really pleased to see that, because really when we do look at the states of relationships and we look at the path that the culture says will lead to that happily ever after, it's not working. I can't think of hardly anybody who, has said, oh yeah, I really love my decision to have sex with every person I dated until I got married. Like I've had other conversations with people though who have said, Arleen, I never thought about practicing chastity and I kind of wish I had. And I understand that, and I think there is that, just that element of things not turning out like people thought they would. And I believe that, when we practice the virtue of chastity, things turn out far better than that.
You told a story about how you were calling, and I guess it was whatever organization compiles these statistics you just mentioned. I can't remember the name, but
Oh yeah, National Center for Health Statistics.
yeah. So you were calling and you were talking to, I guess, one of the researchers there, and you were asking about the 2% that were had not been sexually active, and the researcher said to you that they didn't really interview those people because they were so rare, and they didn't really know what the prognosis was. Like they had some kind of disease.
Yeah. I definitely struggled not to say something. I decided it was probably in everybody's best interest that I didn't respond to that in the way I wanted to in the moment. But yeah, I think it was a great illustration of how virginity is treated in this culture. Nobody's a virgin by choice, according to our culture. It's because there's something wrong with you. It's because nobody wants to have sex with you for some reason, or you don't want to have sex for some reason. And I look back and sometimes I wish I had said something or at least said, by the way, the reason I'm interviewing you, because it wasn't really an interview, actually. It was more like just getting some clarifications on the study that I had read that she'd published. And I didn't tell her, that I was writing an essay about my own virginity in the newspaper. I just told her I was writing an essay about sex. And so I wish sometimes that I had mentioned it just to kind of see what her reaction might have been. And, perhaps I'll have to look her up, send her a little note, maybe a copy of my book.
I was going to say a copy of the book.
Yeah.
Well, the fascinating thing to me was, I think what I would want to know from her was, how did the 98%, how did they feel about their sexual past? And not in a shaming way at all, but, probably most of those people would stand by the sex that they're having with their current partner.
Yeah.
But how do they feel about the sex they had with their last partner or partner 3 or 4 back, like 10 years ago? How do they feel about that? Like, are their lives enriched because of those experiences in the past?
Yeah.
And I just have a really hard time believing that they are.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think I've probably encountered a couple people here and there who have said, that they have no regrets, they don't feel affected by, past sexual experiences. But I remember in college once this was before I'd ever gone public with my virginity. And there was a classmate who was walking with me out of class or whatever. And we were kind of walking across campus. And she started venting to me about, a relationship that was strictly sexual. It was just, a friends with benefits kind of thing. And she said, I never, ever, ever should have done this. I never should have done this, because she was finding that even though she had made that, commitment with this guy, that this was just sex, this was not going to be anything else, she wanted so much more. And I think that's telling, because I think as humans, we are designed for so much more. And, sooner or later, when we're trying to avoid getting that much more because we think we don't need it or can have relationships without the pursuit of it, we inevitably are going to find that it's not fulfilling, and it's not fun. It's more painful than anything else. And obviously this is, just my observation of people like her and others who have vented to me about stuff like this. And so, it's it kind of makes me sad in some ways, because though there is no judgment. It's not for me to tell other people how to live. I just tell people how I live, and if they want to adopt it, go for it. But I hate to see that hurt. I hate to see the existence of that hurt when I know there's a better way. A way that's not going to result in that. And that reminds me of another book I read called I think it's Are You Waiting for the One by Margaret and Dwight Peterson, and they talked about love in that book a lot. And one of the things they said that I think is so relevant here is that if we, even in a dating relationship, if we have truly loved one another, and I don't mean like being in love, I mean like the action, the verb of loving another human being, even if that relationship doesn't lead to marriage, it's, nobody's going to be really hurt in the end. And I mean, there's always going to be grief when a relationship ends. Even I think, after breakups that were mutual or that were my idea, there's always some kind of grief, because, a thing that isn't anymore. And that, that when that happens for anybody, there's going to be grief, but grief and hurt aren't the same thing. And so, I've found that when we truly love each other in that way, a lot of that pain is really avoided.
In any conversation these days where Christians are involved and we're talking comprehensively about sexuality and sexual ethic, there probably needs to be a conversation about the phenomenon of purity culture. Mm-hmm. And you address that in the book quite well. And I'm so thankful for purity culture because for the anti-purity culture movement. I'm so thankful for that because it's pointed out things that I didn't necessarily notice before that are unhealthy about that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I worry that many times a baby is being thrown out with the bathwater.
Yeah. I think the ultimate point I hoped to make with the purity chapter is that purity is not your job. Purity is not my job. I think that purity culture that so many people are speaking out against now very much puts purity in the hands of, for instance, a 10-year-old child who is signing a purity pledge at their youth group. We are told if we've been in youth groups like that as kids, we were told that purity is your job. Like and you will be pure if you don't have sex before marriage. And I think another part of that is that the word purity is being used interchangeably in this case with abstinence and virginity. And there are so many problems with that. I've had a lot of people in responses to what I've written say, like, I'm so glad you're going to be pure until marriage. And I think that's one of the most ridiculous things that anyone could ever say, because, just because you save sex for marriage doesn't mean that, you don't have purity after you've had sex. It just boggles my mind. I don't even know how to really even express the way that it boggles my mind, because it's not about, it's just not about that. And what I would like to give to readers who read, that chapter is the knowledge that Jesus is in charge of your purity. Like, we can only be pure because of him. And so, this obsession in purity culture with shaming people who have had sex before, it needs to stop. Like there's no, that is not part of chastity. You cannot simultaneously practice the virtue of chastity and shame anyone who has ever had sex before outside of marriage. You can't do that. It's that is not chastity. And so I really hope that chapter clears up some stuff about that for some people.
The purity culture that we're referring to places a really unhealthy and I would say unbiblical place on virginity, because the message of the gospel is that you and who you are can be redeemed through Christ.
Absolutely.
And the message of purity culture was, once you lose your virginity, which is what matters most, you can never get that back. And that's so antithetical to the gospel, that no, this is the God who redeems, and even our sexuality, God redeems it. And so I love the terminology of chastity, because you can have made mistakes and then be chaste again.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is, on the other side of that, you can be a virgin and not be chaste.
Absolutely.
And because we can't use the word purity because we've given that so much baggage, but to use it in the better way, you can be a virgin and not be sexually pure in that way as well. And so we've drawn this line that the Bible certainly doesn't draw, that Jesus doesn't draw, with elevating virginity over chastity.
Oh, absolutely. There's this this value placed on virginity, and I think virginity is valuable in some senses, but that's like not the point, and too many people in the past have made it the point. I had a conversation recently with a former professor. She taught my human sexuality class in grad school, and she's a sex therapist, and she's absolutely fabulous, and she's just been a great resource for me. But in our conversation recently, I was asking her about the child's brain, like a kid's brain. Why, I asked her, why is it that as kids go through youth groups where purity culture is rampant, why is it that even if, let's say, their youth minister says, sex is bad until you get married and then sex is good, they can't seem to turn that sex is bad off once they're adults and they've had sex, even if they wait until they're married, in a lot of cases. And so I asked her about the kid's brain, and she said, I wish I could remember which part of the brain. I think it was the prefrontal cortex, is the one that's that's not quite developed enough yet. So kids think very concretely, and the thing is, if at that time, at that stage of their brain's development, the first thing they know, the first thing they're told about sex is the thing that's always going to stick. And so even if they grow up and they begin to realize, oh, that's not true, sex is obviously very good, it's just, better if I'm gonna, follow Jesus Christ to save it for marriage, sex is good, that's, it's not bad. They're always going to have that thought in the back of their head. It's kind of like, my professor said something like, how when you're a kid and they tell you, don't make that face, or your face is going to stay that way. Obviously, that's not true. Your face is not going to stay if you make a funny face. But for the rest of your life, every time you make that funny face, you're going to have that thought. Like, that's just the way the brain works. And so it's very dangerous to introduce sex to kids in any kind of incorrect way, because that can cause a lot of problems for them in adulthood. And I think it's really sad that so many churches and ministers have been so, in my opinion, irresponsible about the ways they've introduced abstinence to kids. I don't think there's anything wrong with promoting abstinence, but I do think that we've done it wrong if we've done that outside of the virtue of chastity and without also discussing sex with kids. I think kids need to know what its definition is. I think kids need to know what its purpose is. And so many kids grow up who turn into adults who are never told. And I just think that needs to change. And so that's another hope that I have for my book. I hope it starts some of those conversations that just haven't been going on.
When I was in the youth group in my church, I have a theory, and I don't know or have any evidence to support this, but I feel like purity culture was kind of at its peak. And so, I mean, who knows how many purity pledges I signed throughout the years. I mean, they were just everywhere. And there's some critiques of purity culture that I don't doubt are legitimate, but they just weren't my experience. And for instance, like a lot of purity culture is very patriarchal and misogynistic, and it emphasizes the purity of women over men. And I can totally see that and see examples in purity culture where that's happened, but that wasn't my experience. It was very equal in that way. One of the things that I did encounter personally was the idea that the reason we are saving ourselves is for our future spouse. And I've got huge problems with that because one, it infers that we will get married, and even sometimes that the reward for saving ourselves will be marriage. And so that relegates people who maybe one are called to singleness for the rest of their lives. It relegates them to second class citizenship. And it also infers that life doesn't really begin until we get married, which is just so incredibly, again, anti the gospel, anti the things that Jesus was about. And Paul says very, very bluntly that it's better if we can go through life without being married. And I feel like the church all but ignores that, and purity culture surely doesn't. And so we kind of create this thing where we say you save sex for because of your future spouse. Well, then if you don't have a spouse in the future, this illusion that you saved it for nothing.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I don't like a lot of the terminology that's traditionally been used like that. Like, you're doing this for the sake of your future spouse, or even I actually don't even like the phrase saving yourself for marriage, because all of a sudden that equates us with sex, and that's just weird and untrue. But yeah, there is that that teaching that, albeit false teaching that that sex is the gift that you give to your spouse. I think sex is a fraction of the gift that you give to your spouse. I think spouses are gifts to each other. Certainly, I think God gives us as gifts to each other. We're pledging our lives to each other when we get married. But I think it's important to be careful about making chastity or making abstinence about having this quote unquote gift of sex to give to a spouse on a wedding night. I think that sort of, I don't know if I want to say cheapens or just kind of diminishes what sex and marriage are, sort of. I think it's certainly a misguided way of describing, I guess, the purpose of saving sex. My favorite chapter in the book is the chapter on providence, and that chapter it was unexpected for me. It just sort of happened providentially, I guess you could say, and I think that's what I write about in that chapter is one of the most important things that we all have to remember. I love the verse that says, seek first his kingdom and everything else will be added, because that's oftentimes one of the most difficult things to do as a single Christian adult. I have found myself having, periodic pity parties about how single I am. And I'm pretty good now at, snapping out of that pretty quickly. But one time, and this happened after I wrote the book, so I didn't get to put it in there. But one time I had an experience where I was, wishing I was hearing from a guy, and a specific guy, not just like a guy at random. But I was hoping this guy would call me or text me or something, and he wasn't doing that. And I began to have that ache that I get when when I realize how single I am and how single I wish I wasn't. And this thought popped into my head that I think only could have come from Jesus. And he said, you don't ache because you're alone. You ache because you're looking in the wrong direction. And the direction that I should have been looking in was, the direction of Jesus, and seeking him first rather than seeking a relationship with some other guy before that. And so that's really the only thing I would want to add, is just for anybody who is practicing the virtue of chastity or interested in doing so, or even for people who aren't, just to remember that, Jesus wasn't kidding when he said, to seek him first and everything else is going to come together, because that's exactly what has always happened to me over and over and over. And I need that reminder still, because I'm a human. And so hopefully that reminder will reach somebody today.
Well, I think that that's a great reminder, because I feel like there's a risk that the people who hear this and the people who read this book will think that you are suffering for the cause, so to speak, that this choice that you made, and even people who think it's admirable might think that, you're just going through life miserable because of this, because of this choice that you made, that you're suffering for Christ or suffering for the cause. And I understand, because you talked about it in the book, that you have a desire to be married, but I get the impression that you're pretty fulfilled with the life that you have right now, that you're not miserable.
I am not miserable at all. It's funny. The subtitle is really quite accurate. Single, happy, and still a virgin. I certainly do have that desire to get married, that desire to meet somebody, but I also think, my world doesn't, crash down around me if I am not, if as it turns out I'm not called to be married. I know I will be just fine.
Seems like you're saying Christ is enough.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, Arleen, it's been so wonderful talking with you. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Remember, you can find all the show notes for this show and all shows at ShaneBlackshear.com. Thanks to those that left ratings and reviews on iTunes this week. Remember, that keeps the show front and center. Also, remember, you can find me on Twitter at @BeardOnABike. That's @BeardOnABike. Also, I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/ShaneBlackshear123. And remember that Seminary Dropout is listener supported. You can visit support seminarydropout.com and press Become a Patron. Remember, this music you're listening to right now is by D.L. Rossi. You can find him online on iTunes and at dlrossi.com. All right, thanks again for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Love you. Take care.
At my best, I always seem to bring that. But there's still hope for me. This